an initial thing that many people go through, and something I will sometimes push on and ask them to reflect on, is even this word of a writer, because so many people will say, oh, well, I don't really identify as a writer. And so I just kind of try to let that stuff be not important at first, right? So that's fine if you don't see yourself that way. I just want you to write.
Hi, and welcome to the Innovative Mindset Podcast. I'm your host, Isolde Trachtenberg. In this weekly show, I bring you in-depth conversations with thought leaders, innovators, and entrepreneurs who inspire us to create ourselves into the people we want to be at work and at home. And now, let's get on with the show. Hello, and welcome to the Innovative Mindset Podcast. My name is Isolde Trachtenberg, and I'm super thrilled that you are here. I'm also incredibly happy to introduce you to this week's guest. I just met her recently. She's amazing. Molly Thornton is a multi-genre writer and writing coach. I already love her, you can tell. Her writing has appeared in the LA Times, They Said Collaborative Writing Anthology, the Seattle Globalist, Lavender Review, Bald Hip Magazine, and tons more. She's a Lambda Literary Fellow and a 2020 City of West Hollywood Pride Poet. I want to know what a City of West Hollywood Pride Poet is. I'm assuming it has something to do with pride, as in like month of Pride in June and LGBTQ Pride, but I'm dying to know what that particular thing is. That's very cool. Molly coaches clients in creative writing and teaches regularly online and at literary centers, including Hugo House, Beyond Baroque, and the LA LGBT Center. Her weekly class, The Right Moves, changes the experience of writing from chore to creative dance party. Oh, I can't wait to talk about this stuff. Molly, I'm so glad you're here. Welcome.
Yay, thanks for having me. Hello.
Oh, this is so fabulous. First of all, I love that you are spending your career both writing and elevating other people to help them write. You're a writer and a writing coach. So let's dive in. What genres do you write in specifically? And then if you want to answer both at the same time, what does a writing coach do?
Sure. So I like to dabble around. I started off really writing poetry and then spent a good amount of time writing fiction. I was working on a young adult fiction project for a couple of years, which I like to say is really how I learned to write, through working on that manuscript. And then since then, the last couple of years have mostly been writing essays, personal essay, and something in between essay and poetry in different forms that I really enjoy and find comes kind of naturally. So that's kind of where I go. I am always thinking about another novel to maybe write, and just really like kind of hopping around. And in terms of writing coaching, what I do is ideally help people to finish their writing. So there's a lot of different ways it can look depending on where someone is, but what I've really found, and part of the reason why I have some things like The Right Moves, which we'll talk about, is I've started creating some offerings like that are sort of pre-coaching. So they're sort of the generative stage of writing, where I find people don't really need that one-on-one touch as much. You really just need some prompts and some support and space to be just getting things down and trying out your ideas. And then as a writing coach, I'm really trying to help people at that point where I found that I got stuck when I was taking creative writing classes, and even starting to have some community of people who could help me with my writing, but still finding that I just couldn't get to the end, or I just didn't get the help I needed to improve my work. And sometimes you're in class and you get feedback from people, and some of it's good and some of it's bad. And so it's just kind of weeding through that and having someone who is on your team, who believes in your work, who has eyes on it through a full draft, through the iterations, and cares about it almost, if not more than you do, which we sometimes need when we're alone with our writing, which can take so much time and so many iterations to get through.
That's so fascinating. I love the idea of having someone. I've written 6 books, so
Wow.
the idea of having someone in my corner who loves my work as much, possibly even more than I do, is amazing. The question becomes then for me, when you're looking at it, you there's a difference between looking at it as a writer versus looking at it as an editor or someone who has seen sort of the work in its current iteration and is looking to improve it. How do you switch those hats? What do you do to go from I'm a writer to I'm helping form someone else's work? What happens inside you to make that happen?
Sure. Well, I really, in general, divorce writing and editing.
Mhm.
And that's something that I really teach. So I think for me, that part comes kind of naturally, where I think of that the writing process as being, like I described, this sort of totally generative, no rules, about just getting things down and having sort of no limits on that. And then the editing and analysis being very different from that. And part of my background is that although I've been writing and writing seriously the past several years, I have been an administrator of some kind pretty much for my entire adulthood,
Mm.
and just have a lot of organizational and analytical skills. And personality wise, I'm someone who just sort of enjoys the sensation of something that's like a puzzle. So I really enjoy looking at creative work in that
Mhm.
way, where you can kind of start to break down something that's so creative and so unbound into little chunks that you can see. You can turn almost anything into a spreadsheet, into little pieces that you can look at and understand structurally.
So it's like you're breaking them down into manageable chunks that can then be moved around, almost like pieces on a chessboard. Is that an okay assessment of that?
Yeah, exactly. So like one of the things that I most love to do, and I have a client I've worked with over the last couple years who is writing an epic novel. And one of the things I did for her on the first read that I did is created what I call, and other people call, a book map,
Mhm.
which is essentially a type of table. It's just a spreadsheet where I've broken down this massive novel into scenes, and then by scene, what the different aspects are of it that need to be tracked based on what's going on in that book. So my client is still using this, and she told me that she just goes to it and then she knows what she has to do because I've written my suggestions in there of what are the holes in this scene or what do you need to consider. So it takes this multiple thousand word document and turns it into something where you have literally a map that you can just say, oh, okay, I'm gonna this is pinpointed here. All I have to do is go to that part of the manuscript and trouble through just that thing at one time.
Incredible. I love it because I remember in writing I've written 2 fiction books, and in writing my 2 fiction books, I kept going, "Am I contradicting something I said in book 1 of the
Mm.
series?" You know? How am I resolving this thing that I started in book 1 in book 2 or something like that? And so do you do this for every client? Do you help them develop this structure for sort of almost tracking the characters in the story of the book? And is it individualized, or do you have a system for developing something like that for everybody you work with?
Yeah, a little bit of a mix of both. I do have a system in terms of the basic structures and the basic elements I'm going to look at.
Mhm.
So, there's some things about a book map that are always going to be the same. Some projects don't need that, just depending on where they're at and
Sure.
how the writer wants to go back and look at them. But for big projects and and even better if you can start to build something like that early on,
Mm-hmm.
then that's something that you can use to guide you throughout. For some people, my personal style is that I'm more someone who likes to just see where it goes and then put some bounds on it later.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't require or necessarily push for people to build the map up front, but to do it afterward. And then the other elements, and that's something that's pretty standard for a lot of writing coaches or developmental editors. There's lots of different names for these various somewhat overlapping ways of working with a writer on their book, is an editorial letter.
Mm-hmm.
So that usually is going to look at some of the same elements over and over. So if we're talking about a novel, it's going to be characters, plot, and just those different pieces of the story structure that are going to be the elements that you need to look at regardless of what the book is.
Mm-hmm.
So there's kind of all these different macro versus micro things that you can shift between, from an Excel sheet, if you like that, or you need it, to an editorial letter that's an overview of here's the broad strokes of the flow and how these things are working together and how the characters fit overall. And then to, comments and suggestions in the text, or broken down even more of, in this scene, this character does this thing that doesn't fit with who they are, or so on and so forth.
So it's so fascinating to me to hear you talk about this idea of breaking things down, whether it's character sheet or plot line or development or things like that. And yet, what about when things break down inside the writer? Like, what about the point where the writer goes, nothing's coming. I can't even string three words together, much less write a story or a novel. As a coach, what are your strategies for helping someone? I hate the word writer's block or the words writer's block because I don't feel like it's a block, but something happens where you get nervous or afraid or stumped to write. As a coach, how do you help someone through that?
Great question. And I would say that that is the biggest piece. Even when we're talking about these techniques or tools, the ultimate thing is the writer dealing with some version of fear,
Mm-hmm.
essentially, on some level, that can come from and look like a lot of different things, and can crop up in different ways at different times, as well as just shifting priorities and things that come up in life. So
Mm.
I think for me, I come from an understanding that there are in some ways always going to be these seasons. And so part of what I want people to understand as writers and learn to trust within themselves is that they're going to have different seasons and different phases of what's going on in their writing life and in their non-writing life. And part of it is just being okay with that. There's going to be times when you are full of ideas and you feel good about writing and you
Mm-hmm.
want to sit down and you have a lot to get out. There's going to be times when you feel good naturally about that editing process and you feel up for going back to old projects and giving them a zhuzh. There's going to be times when you have to paint your house, or you get a new job, or some myriad things are going on that either you're more interested or you're more required to do than tend to your creative life. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. So I think I say that because a lot of common anxiety that people have comes from trying to adhere to some sort of dubious rules of what it means to be a writer that for some reason tend to involve the adage that you should be writing every day, which I just don't really think is true. So part of it is working through, okay, which of these myths or ideas about what a writer is
Mm-hmm.
are you operating from? And that's something that I usually do from the outset with clients as well as students, is some sort of reflection on what is your history with creativity? What is your history with writing? And often immediately people will come on things of, a teacher that they had who was supportive or who was not supportive, early criticism or early encouragement they got, and
Mhm.
maybe some sort of mixed experiences of that informed what they think they're capable of or who they think they are. An initial thing that many people go through, and something I will sometimes push on and ask them to reflect on, is even this word of a writer, because so many people will say, oh, well, I don't really identify as a writer. And so I just kind of try to let that stuff be not important at first, right? So that's fine if you don't see yourself that way. I just want you to write. And so once you notice those things and you know specifically what your limiting ideas are about writing and creativity, hopefully you start to practice noticing, and that helps you shift them. But then in terms of what I can really do as a coach, I can try to create these experiences where you are just writing, and whether or not you're still carrying those fears or worries, it no longer matters because I've tricked you into writing.
I love that. You said some things that I'm like, "Oh, let's dive in." So, let's think about this idea of limiting ideas. What does that mean for this very, in many ways, internal process? How much of that is you as a writer beating yourself up versus how much of it is there are circumstances that keep you from writing or that might have sort of come together or converged in a way that you don't write or you don't have a way of telling your story?
Hmm. Well, I want to answer your question with a question, which,
Yay.
so when you say, so the second part of your question about, right, so like what do you think of when you think of some things that may make it so that you don't have a way of writing your story, or you're unable to write?
I think for me, I was born in another country, English isn't my first language, and even as I said, even though I've written 6 books, it becomes one of those, oh, you have to identify, you have to build the awareness first that it's okay for you to write, that it's okay for you to tell that story. So that's the one of the limiting ideas that I know a lot of people face. But some of the other stuff is time, like you said, time constraints and the being told a lot of immigrants are told, go learn English, or at least when I was growing up, that was the messaging. And it's hard to sometimes realize that you can formulate your story in a language that isn't your native language. So there are some things that stand in the way of being able to tell a story, not just because you don't perhaps feel like you can or like you're able to, but because you
Mm,
really can't, because the
right.
language isn't yours. It's something that you've adopted, if you see what I mean.
I love that. Yeah, that's a huge piece of it. So in terms of my story, to kind of go sideways a little bit, I
Mhm.
have my own experience of that, and that's really what's kind of led me, especially to the teaching part of what I do now.
Mhm.
So long story long, but
I love
I
it.
I think in terms of those myths, so one of the things that at least comes to my mind when I think of people who are writers and authors is they often to me have this story of, oh, I always knew I was going to be a writer,
Mhm.
right? Like, oh, I was, writing novels when I was a child. I was writing short stories. I always knew I would be a published author no matter what. And I very much did not have that experience.
Mhm.
And I really feel that in a lot of ways, I didn't even have the imagination to know that I wanted that, and that I wanted creative life and needed creative life and could have creative life be a central part of my life until well after college, well after, these times of life when you're supposed to be figuring out what your career is and who you are.
Mhm.
But it always was sneaking in. So the reason why partly is because my parents both came from working class backgrounds
Hmm.
and very much taught me that you work, and that work is a pretty specific kind of thing where you go in and you earn wages, and it's not very creative, and you just have to do it, and that's what life is.
Hmm.
And my parents are both really, really creative people who early in their lives didn't figure out or got scared away from or discouraged from having their art and their creative lives be the center of their life, and chose other paths for various reasons. And that's the first thing I learned, right, about what a life path was, because you learn from your parents first.
Sure.
So I it's clear looking back that there's all these ways that there's all these times that I wanted to get close to it. Like when I was doing my bachelor's degree, I was in essentially, I graduated from what's more or less an urban planning major,
Hmm.
but I used my senior project to create a conceptual feminist art show
Oh,
within.
fantastic.
So I was always finding these ways to kind of go outside the lines. And also, that's part of just who I am. And for me, I now identify part of the reason that I didn't know that I wanted to write and about creative writing for so long is because as a writer, you can just have so many different interests, right? And I just had so many different interests and so many different things I wanted to learn about.
Hmm.
And also, when you're in school, you're always being asked to write. So the whole time I was in school, I wasn't thinking, oh, I really wish I could write a story right now. I was constantly being asked to synthesize information and put it into words. And I didn't think about the fact that that came naturally to me, or that I enjoyed doing that. As you say, when you have learned another language or are trying to learn it, that you're having that visceral experience of struggling with that and needing to figure out a way through it, or butting up against it. And sometimes when things are not difficult for you, you think that everyone is that way, right? And you just sort of think, oh, well, that's not special, or that's not unique to me. That's just something that in life is simple.
Yeah, it's so fascinating that you said that. This idea of it's easy for me, therefore it must be easy for everyone. And there's a caveat or a corollary to that, and that must mean it's not worth all that much. You know,
Exactly.
there's a strange internal story we tell ourselves about that, I think, and that adds to that idea of limiting ideas or limiting beliefs.
Yeah. So I guess, right. So what I would say with that is that those things can be so ground in that, yeah, it took me this series of years of beginning to notice these things, beginning to have questions about what I was doing, and then just starting to write, starting to have just poetry and taking poetry classes, and then starting to write the novel, and just being determined to find space for this in my life without, as I said, having the imagination, still not being able to see what that even meant. I didn't know anyone who had a book. I didn't know anyone who was an author. I didn't even really know anyone who was just having a creative life, who was doing art. I didn't know what that would look like, and I didn't understand publishing or the literary world or any of the things that that can mean.
Hmm.
And I really just had to start little by little taking in different influences and continuing to take classes and reading about writing until I had any semblance of an idea about what that meant. I was just thinking that one of the first experiences that I had that helped me with that is that I had a roommate who was a playwright, who was younger than me and literally would just write plays, and then the plays would be staged. You know, I saw one of their plays, and they were someone who didn't care, or at least didn't prioritize cooking, cleaning, people pleasing, any of these things that to me I couldn't get away from. I couldn't get out of my own way to deprioritize them to have my creative life. And I started having a shift in understanding when I saw that in my house, when I saw, oh, this is what it looks like. You just sit down and do it. And also, that means sometimes that you don't do everything else. So I think that's a huge part of the limiting beliefs thing and the time thing and all of that. There's a lot of different components. One is that with the time thing is that we often think that we need much more time than we do. Yes, it takes a really long time, and it does take a lot of cumulative time to write and edit and complete a book, but it also doesn't have to take 8 hours a day or your whole life. Something that happens in the Right Moves, where the longest writing session we have is a 15-minute block. And every time someone says, oh my gosh, I can't believe how much writing I just got done. I can't believe, I always forget that if I just sit down and focus for a short amount of time, I can get so much done. So I think that's true time and again, and it really is just a matter of carving that out, even if it is those 15 minutes, and dealing with the fact that that means that you can't always do everything else. Like, you have to love getting to do the writing more than you love indulging all of your current distractions or even priorities. I have a friend who is an author and a mom and teaches at a college. And around this same time, several years ago, when I met her, I remember her saying something to me like that she made a strategic long-term decision not to have a clean house, because between her kids and her job, there was no way that the writing was going to be done ever if having a spotless house was important.
I love that so much because if you could see my office right now, you would understand how consciously or unconsciously I have made that same strategic long-term
Yes.
plan. That's great. Well, okay, so you brought that up and I want to talk about it. What is the right moves? It sounds like it's obviously very effective, but what is it? What made you start it and what are your goals for it?
Ooh, good question. My goals for it. Well, the Right Moves is a weekly online live class that I've been teaching the last couple months, and it's a combination of dancing and writing.
Ah, I love it.
The reason that it started is because it's a practice that I started using to, as I like to say, trick myself into writing. So it really goes back a few years, and there's a lot of different influences in terms of some friends who were doing projects like that. For instance, a few years ago, I had a friend who's a poet just randomly ask if I wanted to participate in a project where she was having a bunch of different people schedule a time where they were dancing to the same song at the same time in different locations, and then write something to each other
Mhm.
afterward. And around the same time, I was getting back to just my own personal dance and movement practice, which when I was a kid who was in dance classes, and I was not a kid who excelled at them. I wanted to wear the leotards and sparkly stuff. I wanted to hang out with my girlfriends and run around and play. And I wanted the finished result, but I wasn't that talented at it, and I didn't really want to compete. And I pretty quickly hit a point where most of my friends were moving levels ahead before I was, and I didn't, then it wasn't fun anymore because that wasn't what I was there to do. I wasn't there to, be disciplined and be training. I was there
Mm-hmm.
to be dancing.
Mm-hmm.
And so it really took a lot of years after that, and then continuing to have this similar experience in many sports throughout high school, where I also didn't make the team or was the worst player and so on and so forth.
Oh, yeah.
So I was like, I don't want those things,
Mm-hmm.
because I had only ever seen them in these competitive situations where it was about a certain type of excellence, and that wasn't what I was there for. And
Right.
I didn't find anything else. And I, for years and years, maybe did some yoga after that. And that was pretty much it. And in my late 20s, I started doing this dance class, which is awesome, which you can do online now, which is called Dance Church, that started in Seattle, Washington. And the first time that friends were talking about this, I was like, what the hell is Dance Church? Because, what is that name? But it's essentially an aerobic dance class that has no choreography, has super fun dancers who teach it, and it's just this super sweaty hour and a half dancing in a dark room with other people as if you were at a club, but no one is drinking and it's 10 o'clock in the morning.
Oh my goodness. I love it.
I loved it too. So that I really, really, really was drawn to that. And that really got me back in my body and enjoying dance in this time when also, right, I was aging out of the time when I was doing that dancing in the club at midnight on Saturdays. But I still wanted to be dancing. And that really brought that kind of movement and the joy of that back into my life, and that developed into a project with another friend who's a writer and musician, where we started to video ourselves dancing and then would immediately write afterward. And we did this over a series of a few months,
Mm-hmm.
and then we were witnessing each other. So
Mm-hmm.
we would exchange the videos that we had made, we would exchange the writing, and then debrief what the writing was like, what the process was like. And that really, really deepened my experience, both with doing that with myself and the power of doing it with others, and sparked a lot of ideas and hope between us about different ways that other people could plug into that and where it could go. And from there, it kind of went dormant, except for that it's something that I continued to do, because I just find that if I dance and then I sit down and write, all the sort of thinking that you think you need to do to write, that actually makes you stare at the page and think you have writer's block or whatever it is, the dancing is one of those things that makes those things go away. And you're just able to let whatever is in there out. So the moment of the right moves becoming a class this year really comes out of the time that we are in right now, where we are largely isolated from one another.
Mm-hmm.
And I personally get so quickly, so easily burnt out on being on the screen with other people.
Mm-hmm.
I find it really difficult. And after a couple of months of quarantine, I was the first person who was like not showing up for Zoom hangouts with my friends, who was like not returning text messages, who was just becoming more and more isolated, because I just couldn't bear to spend any more of my time on the computer and navigating social space in that way. And at the same time, having such an urge for that, such a need for connection and a need to create. So in the right moves, it's kind of, again, I'm like want to hack everything.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of trying to hack the fact that we can only be together in virtual space right now,
Mm-hmm.
but without wanting it to feel like we're in virtual space. So the way that that works in the right moves is that we spend almost half of the class, or we spend, cumulatively 10, 15, 20 minutes dancing, stretching, moving our bodies, so that we're continuing to be reminded, even though we're using the computer, that we're there, that we're there in our bodies, we're there in physical space, and we're witnessing other people doing the same. And that's bar none my favorite moment in every class, is some minute when I look over in the middle of a song and just see everyone just doing their little dance in their room. And it's so special to me. So it's just a generative class. We do a lot of writing that's just for you. So I encourage people to bring something that they're thinking about, or a project they're already working on, and have some space to just puzzle through that
Mm-hmm.
and keep it personal, which I think is something we sometimes need in a workshop. Is you don't necessarily want to have to write on the spot for that audience. So it has a component of being able to write for yourself and just have devoted writing time like you would if you were doing it on your own. And then it also has this collaborative and community piece that we do later on in it, when typically, I put people into breakout rooms and give them a little bit of a collaborative writing prompt to do together. So, for instance, last week we did, our theme was around the house. And I gave each group an image of a different type of house. And they then wrote a story about the residents of the house together, and then came back and reported them to us. And it was so much fun. And one of the things that surprised me about it the most is I then asked the other groups to try to guess what the house was like based on the story of the residents that had been told. And they perfectly could guess. One of them was like a fairy tale kind of house, like Hansel and Gretel style. And one was this like
Mm-hmm.
big modern mansion. And it was so cool. It was such a cool example of the power of writing and effective writing, to see, oh, you can describe, you know we can guess the surroundings based on the people, with just these little details scattered in between. So I love the writing part of that. And it's also really wonderful because it's, as a friend called it, who helped me, who was in a workshopping of the workshop, said, oh, this gives people chance encounters, which is another thing that we don't have much of right now, as we're mostly at home. So having a little bit of an opportunity to get to know someone new in an interesting way, that you otherwise wouldn't right now.
Absolutely. And it's fascinating to me, creating together. That creative collaboration is sort of my end all be all goal of life, if you will. And I go into companies and I help them do that through various means. And it sounds like you're doing the same thing with the right moves, with providing that opportunity for people to create something together. I remember in the workshop that I took with you, um, in the San Gabriel Valley Women's Writing Group, that's where I met you. You had us do a breakout room, and it was about somebody quitting a job. And immediately, I sort of went into this weird place of the reason the woman was quitting a job is because Tom kept pawing at her, but Tom was a dog, and the owner kept bringing the dog in, and that's actually become a scene in the next novel that I'm writing. So it's really interesting how it was able to come through from that chance moment of working. And then now I'm taking parts of it and making it into a scene, and it's going to be in a book and all of this. So thank you for that. And the question that I have around this idea of creatively collaborating with others through dance and writing, how do you think being in your body for all of these writers that you're working with, how does it relate to getting the writing done? What do you think happens through the collaboration and through the dance that helps you write?
Great question. How does it get us to write? Well, I think when I think about, when you know what you want to write, or you just know that you want to write and you can't get to it, you just need some version of a side door.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of an invisible side door. So I think part of the way to get through that door, in my experience, and the way I like to teach it, is with some sort of constraint. So
Mm-hmm.
there's kind of two different elements to what I bring into any kind of workshop I'm leading. Typically, one is constraints, and another I would call either ritual or habits.
Mm-hmm.
So both of those things kind of do both of those things. So I
Mm-hmm.
think part of the reason in general why coming to a class is effective is there's a ritual to it.
Mm-hmm.
You are not just at home saying, okay, this is my writing time. It's 6 o'clock on Tuesday. I have to write now. You're literally going into a different space. You are gathering your tools. You're thinking about the fact you're going to do that. And then you're having it reinforced by other people who are also buying into that, who are
Mm-hmm.
thinking, here, we're doing that now. And that creates a ritual where there's that habit building of, oh, I did this, so that means I do this, right? I came to this classroom with my computer, with my journal. That means that I'm going to write now. And that's rituals take out the decision fatigue, which for me, and I know for others, is a huge thing, but I'm
Mm-hmm.
horrible with it. I am the kind of person who cannot decide what to eat for dinner. Like, if you ask me what restaurant I want to get dinner from,
Mm-hmm.
I blank out. But if there's a box of macaroni and cheese and some leftovers from yesterday in the fridge, and I have to choose between those two things, that's great, right? Because that's an easy decision to make. I'm
Mm-hmm.
just going to have that, or I'm going to have that. And I don't have to have this full imagination of all the foods that are available to order to my door, because I'm so privileged and lucky that I live in a city full of every restaurant possible. So it's the same thing. If you're coming to a space and it's time to write, then you don't have any other questions to ask about what you could be doing with that time. That's it.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can add constraints on top of that. So instead of saying, sit down, write about anything, if I say, sit down and respond to this section in this book about someone quitting their job, I don't care if you write about that or not, right? That's not the point.
Mm-hmm.
I don't care. It's not important to me that you complete the assignment as given. If I ask my students to write about the residents of this house and they end up on a completely different track, they're not going to get, I always say, you're not going to be graded,
Right.
right? Because that's another thing that a lot of people have built in, that I find that I'm working against, is just these sort of like perfect student
Mm-hmm.
obsessions, and the want to like get the high score, to do it right. And so I'm just kind of trying to turn things so upside down that you're not seeing yourself that way, right? So if you're in a writing workshop and you're being told, okay, so now I want you to follow this prompt where you're going to like dance, and you're gonna like dance with the plant in your room, and then you're gonna make a list of like 5 foods you like to eat, and then you're gonna make a list of something else, and then you're gonna light a candle, and then you're gonna write about it. You're almost like so confused that you can't think about your like getting it right? Like
Right.
you can't get it right if I give you an off the wall prompt. All you can do is just listen to your own associations that begin to come up and just trust them. And so it's just kind of like any way to break through that. So being physical, dancing, I think has some just the somatics of that wake up different memories, which I don't know all that much about, but I
Mm-hmm.
know on some level is what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
And just breaking out your own barriers by shifting you out of the way that you're normally being asked to think, the way that you're normally being asked to perform, to do the majority of the things that we have to do for our jobs and our lives the rest of the time, which are not often creative, which often do require us to be linear and efficient in a different way and task oriented. And we kind of just need to shake it off. And that takes a lot of work.
It really does, and it's really I love that you said that idea of being task oriented. One of the things that I do when I work with companies and organizations is to take those very tasks and see what are the innovative and creative ways that you can approach those tasks. So you have to give yourself permission to think differently and to allow inspiration to strike, even if the task itself seems very mundane. So I love that you talk about that, and and I'm very curious about this idea of constraints. When you constrain it's almost like you're creating a funnel, if you see what I mean. So when you're working with either in the right moves or your individual clients, how do you provide those? I see in the right moves that you're giving off the wall sort of converging information, if you will, to get them out of their own inner critic brain. But what do you do with the individual writer who wants to complete a 120,000 word novel?
Mhm. So, in terms of the generation, some of the strategies are the same. So, in other classes that I teach, I often use constraints that are just prompts.
Mhm.
So, I have I have a poetry class called Poem Hunting, which
Mhm.
is a series of poems to read and then prompts that are loosely built from those. And they are giving you, like I described, these different things to respond to in
Mhm.
order to write a poem.
Mhm.
And when someone comes out of that class, they have somewhere between 10 and 15 new poems that they've written, right?
Wow.
So that's over the course of a month. And so 10 or 15 poems, that's halfway to a poetry chapbook.
Mhm.
So again, that's kind of taking it piece by piece where you're not thinking about the whole thing at once. And
Mhm.
when I'm doing teaching, sort of personal essay things, I like to use forms that are sometimes from everyday forms.
Mhm.
So like taking something you want to write about or generating ideas of things that you're interested in writing about and then writing it as a letter, writing it as a recipe, writing it as a how-to, as an ABCs. I love that stuff. And in terms of breaking down a novel, I really like to combine the tools of quote unquote craft with these internal things we've been talking about of
Mhm.
what how does the writer do the writing
Mhm.
besides how the writing goes.
Mhm.
So I do you know about National Novel Writing Month?
Sure.
Have you
NaNoWriMo, yes.
participated?
I'm sorry?
Have you participated in it?
No, I never have because I am also a musician, and November and December are big gig months. So I'm usually gigging just about every day and don't have time to also. So I do Is No Rimo, which is Isolde's novel writing month, which is in January when things slow down.
Yes, also the start of the year, a great time
Yeah.
to do that.
Yeah.
So I love National Novel Writing Month, which for those who don't know it is a national challenge to write 50,000 words in the month of November. It happens every year. It's free. It just takes all the time you have. And
Truly.
it's really fun. And the organization that runs it is really encouraging, has tons of resources. They're really, really cool. And the first novel manuscript that I completed, I started as a NaNoWriMo
Hmm.
project. So I really love it. I love the energy of so many people just taking a stab at writing that's so unpretentious and just about having fun with it. So I last year taught at Hugo House in Seattle a class that was sold out called How to Plan a Novel in 10 Days
Mm.
in October, which was preparation for November, which I'm sure is so popular because of this question of how do you break down how you're going to write a novel.
Hmm.
So what it does is it's first of all a crash course in writing, and secondly it gives you assignments of things to do that prepare you both for the writing and for the writing in terms of your emotional physical space
Right.
and how to construct a story. So it goes from, letting people in your life know that you're going to be committed to that for a certain time period and what that's going to look like, trying to take things off your plate, like we talked about, for temporary time, and thinking about how you motivate yourself and how you demotivate yourself. What
Hmm.
are your normal distractions? And how can you not necessarily stop yourself from doing them, but turn them into rewards, right? Like if you really want to scroll your phone for 15 minutes, that's fine. Just set a timer that you're going to write for 15 minutes or for 500 words, whatever it is, and then you get to do the thing you want to do. So you build a reward system for yourself and just really thinking about what is this actually going to mean in my life in terms of logistics, in terms of my writing space, and just getting organized. And
Hmm.
then it has these components that are having you just build a concept and characters and some ideas of things that can happen in your story that are really juicy and rich. So, no, you don't have to know exactly what's going to happen. If you are a devout outliner and you love to know everything that's going to happen and plot it beforehand, that's great. And you can do that, but you don't have to. So, the
Hmm.
idea of what I teach is giving you teaching you how to develop a couple of main characters, some situations, and some ways those situations can play out that are going to give you some structure for that month. So you end up coming up with a bunch of different scenes as well. So then if worse comes to worse, you have 30 days of scenes, right? And you have a couple of characters. And every day, all you have to do is sit down and write like 1,500 words about those characters in that scene.
Right.
And that will make a novel.
Yeah, that's great. I love it. It's so what you're talking about is something that actually reminds me of something that I did in 2010 and 2011 because I started it in June of 2010. I did this thing where I wrote a short story every single day for a year, and it was based on a word prompt. And I would get the word prompt from a site that no longer exists, unfortunately, called oneword.com. And what it was you got a word prompt, and it could be anything like cotton ball or sink or
Yeah.
whatever they wanted. And then you had 1 minute to write about it, but I decided to write a story incorporating the word. The key was that I only had 1 minute to write the story.
Yes.
So that kind of constraint revolutionized my writing. And so what you're talking about with this idea of constraints and coming up with the plan, the scene, the characters, and this is all you have to do today, it's freeing in a way, even though you have these boundaries. It really
Exactly.
it revolutionized how I did what I did. And I came out with stories that I ended up turning into little mini screenplays, and those screenplays got made into movies, and it sort of blossomed from there. But what it really did was it impacted how I view giving myself permission to write.
Mhm.
And I'm wondering about that for you. You combine this idea of organization, like 30 scenes, two characters, 30 days, go, and also creativity to achieve what you do and to help your clients achieve what they do. How how do you develop that for them? And again, I'm curious about whether or not you're working with groups to do this in classes, and also how you do it for individuals. How do you help someone who's thrown their hands up and goes, I feel like my brain is dead. I don't know what to say. I don't know how to do this. What is your set of steps to helping someone who really wants to write in that way but has just shut down?
So it depends on where they're starting, right? If they're starting at, I don't know what to do and I have zero written, then as a one-on-one client, they're probably not going to be that. They're probably going to be in a class because they don't really need a custom prompt for me. Like you
Mhm.
said, you can go to a website like you said and get a prompt, and if you just need to write, you can just write. So working on the right moves, and I have a class that I've taught that's specifically for this kind of building the writing habit and the permission that I've taught in real life multiple times. That's called Ritual, Writual.
Love
That's
it.
about that's about how you, I call it building a bridge, like building a bridge to your creativity.
Mhm.
So that's really just getting in that habit, doing those reflection questions I said before about where we're digging into what exactly are you believing and are you operating on that's making it so that you can't do this at all. And
Mhm.
often it's things like, oh, well, I can't write if I'm interrupted. Like I need the whole day to do it. Or it's sometimes, people also have internalized and intellectualized a lot of advice and they already know, but they just haven't done it.
Mhm.
And so that's a question that I've been thinking for myself a lot, and that I'm sometimes direct in a different way at students and clients is, what do you already know that you're not doing? Right, like just implementing what we already know we should be doing. It's not going to help someone, for them to have one-on-one coaching with me and for
Mhm.
me to tell them a bunch of writing advice and tell them what their hangup is when they already know.
Mhm.
So those people, I really just need to get them writing. Talking about it isn't going to help. So I want to get them in one of these generative classes where they're just going for it. Then when you have anything at all, when there's part of a draft, when there's a couple of essays that are unfinished, and there's a handful of poems, there's a novel that's been in the drawer, then when we have any of those things to go off of, then I can, as a coach, really breathe some life back into those things. And part of that then comes, the magic that I said of the elements that I used to overlook because they were invisible to me, of my natural skills around it, which is that I am really good at analyzing story,
Mhm.
and I'm really good at intuiting how things go together. I love the curating aspect. I love things that are associative. I love things that are braids, and I have a sense of how things go together. So when I see a partial draft of something or a few partial drafts, I can look at them and say, this is what's missing, or have questions about, ask questions that are going to draw out more of where the story can go. And I mean, I'm talking about it as if it's story and it's always narrative, which it's not always. And
Mm-hmm.
a lot of the writing that I do is not. Like you said, I love your story about writing a story every day. That's amazing. But the one word prompt, the manuscript that I have that is completed, that I'm seeking publication for, is 100 vignettes that are each exactly 100 words
Oh,
long,
wow.
which is exactly what you said. It was this thing that was so open and so bounded at the same
Mm-hmm.
time,
Mm-hmm.
that made this sort of fertile field. So when it comes to someone who really has a project going, I'm never gonna I'm never gonna direct what the creative part of that should be, right? I'm never gonna say, oh, well, you really wanted this to be about your son and your relationship with him, but you said this really interesting thing about your divorce, and I want you to make it about that. Right. Like I'm
Right.
never gonna tell someone what their writing has to be about, or pull something out of thin air that's gonna be an add-on, or require that they put it in a form that it doesn't belong to. But one thing that I have done is to give someone a story framework when that is helpful to them.
Mm-hmm.
So like one of my clients, is writing a sort of like memoir self-help book, and was writing and writing and writing, but not knowing what the component should be and where to go with it. And so I taught her the framework of the hero's journey.
Mm.
Again, you don't have to write on the hero's journey, and there's other ways to tell a story, but as is who says it? Is it Thomas More, who's the expert on that? So I think they've proven that we have some sort of sense of this story, whether it's just because there's so many stories, at least in the Western canon, that follow it.
Sure.
So it's a natural sense of story that many of us have, that you have a hero. You start with a person who is in their small life, and then they see or are called to an adventure, and they don't want to go, and then they go, and then they meet someone who helps them, and then they meet friends and allies, and then they tussle with enemies, and then they face their death, and so on and so forth, until they bring home the elixir. So for my client who's writing this memoir and self-help, she loved this because she didn't have any structure at all, and that gave her a backbone to think about, oh, okay, so when I'm wanting to insert these moments from my life in here, I'm going to structure it based on this backbone.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not just, well, here's 20 years of my life I want to talk about. How do I do it? But okay, so start before you started your career. What was the first challenge? Who were you then? And then what was your greatest challenge? When did you face metaphorical death, right? And that begins to give us a system that we can build a story around.
Absolutely. And I think that you're talking about Joseph Campbell, perhaps?
Yeah, thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah, absolutely. I love his work. Yeah, and this idea, it's so fascinating to me and so powerful that we are each the hero of our own story.
Right.
That everybody has the possibility and perhaps even the capability of telling their own story where they are the hero and where they overcome whatever it is they overcome to emerge at the end of the tale. It's interesting. One of my favorite examples of the hero's journey is, I don't know how old you are. I don't know if you ever watched the show Northern Exposure, which was about Rob Morrow played a doctor from New York who had to go to a tiny town called Sicily, Alaska to work as their doctor because they paid for his med school. And when Rob Morrow decided to leave the show, that episode was a hero's journey. They actually talked about it being the hero's journey and all of the lessons that happened along the way, facing your first challenge, friends and allies, enemies, everything, the metaphorical death, everything was beautifully structured. So if you ever want a really good example, finding
Cool.
his episode, and that's what I tell all my students when I talk to them, watch that episode of that show because it details the hero's journey to a T, literally, because they talk about it as the hero's journey. So it's this idea of being our own hero, and it doesn't matter what your journey is. What matters is that you end up having to go on it and make it happen. And if you were the hero, what would you do? And so what I wonder for you, being the hero of your story, of your journey, what is the journey's end for you? What is the process that you see yourself going as you go on your own journey?
Oh, geez, big question. What elixir will I bring home?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think when you were talking about that, it was making me think about a couple of sort of like alternatives or additions to that too. One being for people who don't want to write a hero's journey and that doesn't resonate with them. I always start with I want to know what inspires and what kind of reading the writer I'm working with likes to do.
Mhm.
So if they don't want to have the Northern Exposure tale, then what's their favorite book? What writers are they studying? And the same way, right, that we know the hero's journey is tried and true, but you can analyze and attempt to map your version of what you want to do or how it's working on any book and
Mhm.
on
Mhm.
the way that any writer has written. When you
Mhm.
want to look for structure, any book has a structure. Sure, some are probably better than others and some are easier to see than others, but you can learn at least a starting point for the backbone of what you want to write and how you want to write from any book that you like. And it also makes me think about, right, this adventure, this hero thing, and that so many people don't identify with that. And that's been part of the learning curve with me. And part of the permission is learning that who your individual story is a story that happened
Mhm.
and becoming visible to yourself and being able to see who you are, the choices that you make and have made, and that all of that is interesting. And some people naturally know that about themselves, and some people are more socialized to know that about themselves.
Mhm.
And some of us are not. And a lot of people think, oh, I've just had this sort of like boring life, or, oh, that's not interesting because just I did that. And really having to become excited about your own story and valuing it. So for me, the way that that started to happen in my writing is, like I said, the first novel that I wrote, the first really big thing that I wrote was a young adult novel. And it was fully fictional. And also, I know that I started there because there were things about my teenage experience that were, and in some ways still are, really fresh for me and that I want to write about and that are important. And I couldn't, there's nothing wrong with writing fiction, but also at that point, it was that I couldn't imagine myself being in my writing. And some of the next things I wrote were some short stories. And at one point I wrote a short story that later on, when I looked back on it, I said, oh, verbatim, this is an experience from my life, right? This is not a fictional story that I just wrote. I had to see myself as not being in it in order to begin to write about my own experiences
Mhm.
as very slow path to building the permission and acknowledgement and valuing of myself and my experiences to be able to be the person in the story that's led to being able to write some personal essay and things that really are about what I'm doing and what I have done. There's an essay that I've been working on all summer, which is about two of my greatest reading influences when I was a kid, one being R.L. Stine and all the Goosebumps and Fear Street books, and the other being Francesca Lia Block, who is an amazing living Los Angeles writer who wrote these sort of like dark fairy tales that I've learned as an adult have this cult following of girls of around my age who found these magical things in the library as kids, who opened us up to ideas of queerness and just magic and all of these things. And the essay is about those two influences and about my earliest childhood friendship, best friendship, and the story of that friendship and relationship mixed with the influences of these two authors. So that's something that I couldn't have written before. And so now that I get into those things, I have more and more interest in doing work that's researched as well. So another part of my story that I just was ignoring and didn't even talk about for a really long time is that the first college that I went to, Antioch College, is a funky, super radical school in Ohio that has a tumultuous history, and it closed when I was a student.
Wow.
And when it closed, because we were radicals and there's a culture of activism, we tried to save the school and created a guerrilla school for a year that was unaccredited while people were fundraising to try to keep the school alive. And in the past few months, I finally sat down and was like, I have to go here. It's really scary for me because there's so much personally and in that story that's confusing and that went on. And just in little bits, I started interviewing other people about it. That was the first time that that's been part of my writing process. Reading, I discovered the New York Times archive online that goes back to like forever, and was reading articles about the school from the 1800s, which was amazing. So I'm just sort of like building those tools right now and just having a bigger imagination about what can I write and what do I want to write and where will those things go. So for me, I'm a little bit like nose to the grindstone of just getting through the everyday right now. So where my story will end, I don't really know, but I am just I'm just working on being open and, through my own seasons of writing and not writing and what I'm writing, just continuing to commit to my creative life and also being flexible about what that looks like and realizing that as integral as writing is to me and that it's always something I'll do because it's a sense of expression that feels important to me, that there's other things in my life that are part of my creative life. My dancing is something that I do regularly right now and have for a long time. And that's part of my creative life and my expression and having a larger sense of my identity so that I'm also not beholden to these specific expectations of what a writer does or trying to value myself based on, very limiting factors of the definition of a writer. And in terms of my teaching and coaching, it's an exciting time because I've been doing all these things for a few years, and in some ways, I feel really limited by not being able to be in real time and real space with people and have a yearning for that. And I also have been able to share a lot of the classes I've built and that I've come up with a different audience and with more people because they can be available online now. And that's really awesome. So I've generated so many different things over the last few years, depending on just what I was interested in or what I was asked to do, that now I have kind of an awesome library of resources and strategies that I've tried that are kind of beautifully coming together into more of a system of offerings now of, like you asked, well, what do you do when you're at this point? When you have this point? And so I'm
Mm-hmm.
beginning to have an answer to that of where I'd like someone to plug in based on what tools they need and where they're at in their writing process, that are going to make sense for them.
Oh, I love that. And I'm so glad that you have almost a library, a stable, if you will, of the different things depending on the needs of the person or people you're working with. Speaking of that, I want to be I look, I could honestly, Molly, I could talk to you for the next 6 hours, but I recognize that you have a life to get back to. So with that in mind, I would love to know, where can people find this amazing library of offerings? Where can people find you on social media, your website? Because I'm going to put it all in the show notes, but I'd love it if you'd say it just so that we have it both ways.
Perfect. Yes, my everything is always centralized on my website. It is my name, mollythorntonwrites.com. So on my website, you can learn more about my coaching. You can set up a call with me to tell me about your project, and you can see whatever classes are running. Some of the stuff that is in the works or is on there now or is going to come back is the ritual class, which is really just a great place to start or restart your writing process. Poem hunting, which is a super fun class, whether or not you are a poet, to think a different way and get some writing down. The right moves is the live class running right now, and just always scheming on just helping people with what they need. And you can find me on social media, also Molly Thornton Writes, but with an underscore in there. So check the show notes on Instagram and on Twitter, kind of.
I'm the same
Kind
way.
of.
I'm the same way with Twitter. I'm kind of on Twitter. I don't know if it's my generation or if something else, but I can't quit. Twitter and I are frenemies, I guess. We're not friends very well. So okay. I wanna say first, thank you, because I love the way you think, and I love that you have dedicated your life to helping bring other people's creativity to the forefront, just like you're bringing your own creativity to the forefront. On behalf of everybody whose lives you touch, I'm grateful. So thank you so much for doing that.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I want to add on that just really quickly since you put it that way. Thank you so much. And in terms of, why I became a teacher and why I do share the what I do, that's a huge part of it because I felt like all of this was opaque to me.
Hmm.
And there was so much that no one told me and I didn't know who to ask, or the people who seemed like they had the answers wouldn't give them. And it's just very much my nature that once I figure something out, especially something that's been held from me, I just want everyone to know and have it be demystified and not think that being a writer is some lofty thing that is only in academia or that only certain people can do. It's accessible, and also there are some structures within it, and you can very much know how they work.
Absolutely. And we're all storytellers. We all have stories inside us. Stories have been passed down since prehistory through the oral tradition. So there is a story. If you want to tell a story, there is a way to do it, and contact Molly if you want to have help in telling your story. I think that's a good way to go. But yeah, remember, we are all storytellers in one way or another, and I think that's something for us all to remember.
Yep, I agree. Thank you so much. This has been such a treat. I'm so honored to be one of your guests.
I'm so glad you were here. And Molly, I have a question that I
Yes.
ask everybody who comes on the show. It's the last question I always ask. And it's a silly question, but I find that we get some really interesting answers. And the question is this: if you had a plane that could skywrite anything for the whole world to see, what would you say?
A plane that could skywrite anything into the sky. Right now, I would have it say a big warm hug.
Oh, that's lovely. What a sweet and wonderful sentiment. That's great. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Molly. This has been Molly Thornton talking about writing and talking about coaching and talking about helping other people tell their stories while she tells hers. And I'm so excited that we've gotten a chance to have this conversation. Thank you again, Molly, for joining me. If you have enjoyed this episode, please get in touch with Molly to learn more about writing. Get in touch with me if you want to comment, if you want to ask a question about innovation, creative thinking, or collaboration. You know what to do, isoldat.com/question. Until next time, I want to thank you and I want to remind you to listen, learn, laugh, and love a lot. All right, so you thought we were done, but we're not done. And here's the thing. This is almost like a PS or a caveat. Molly, I would love it if you would talk a little bit. We said we'd talk about it and then I forgot, so it's all my fault. I'd love it if you would talk a little bit about what are Pride Poets? What is that and what do you do with it?
Yes, we have to go back to the first unanswered question. So the Pride Poets is a really wonderful project that the city of West Hollywood has funded and made possible the last couple of years, I believe, headed by a wonderful typewriter poet named Brian Sonia Wallace. And what it's all about is writing custom poems for people who need a poem, and they can be on anything. So this year was a little different because we were doing it virtually rather than being at events with typewriters set up, meeting folks. So we actually had more opportunity to collaborate and work together as poets in little teams to write poems that people requested on anything from, how to deal with the blues to a housewarming blessing for someone's new home that they bought. And that was just a really lovely process for me of learning to write poetry that way on the spot and for people, which is another amazing prompt. So I now am a trained typewriter poet and would love to be writing custom poems for folks as well.
I love that. What a phenomenal idea. That's so cool. Yes. So how do people find that? How do people find Pride Poet?
So I don't know exactly what the website is, but if you search for West Hollywood Pride Poets, you will find the info on that. And it coincides with Pride Month. It's all LGBTQ poets and focused on writing for that community. So it's in June every year, and it'll come back next year, hopefully. And if you want to be a Pride poet, you can also find info on applying as well.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much for that. And yes, the question has been answered. We've put the final punctuation mark on our conversation, Molly. Thank you again so much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you being here. Today's episode was produced by Isolde Trachtenberg and is copyright 2020. As always, please remember this is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Past performance does not guarantee future results, although we can always hope. Until next time, this is Isolde Trachtenberg, and I send you all of my love.